Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Ecoflix podcast. Today, I have the privilege of chatting with Jon Bowermaster, an oceans expert, a remarkable and highly regarded adventurer, an award-winning filmmaker. No, I'm just getting started. He has more than 30 documentaries to his credit, as well as an 8-part National Geographic Channel series. He is a prolific journalist published by the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, Rolling Stone, and many more. Jon's the author of 11 books. And of course, in his free time, he teaches a college course about the environment, hosts his own radio show it's called the Green Radio Hour. And he continues to produce an ongoing series of short films about the environmental risks near his home in the Hudson River Valley, sometimes referred to as the birthplace of the American environmental movement. Jon, welcome to the Ecoflix podcast.
Yeah, thank you, David. You sound like you're describing a very old man, so I appreciate.
I would say very accomplished man, and it's really my pleasure to have a chance to talk with you today about your remarkable body of work. Aside from the sheer number of things, documentaries, books, TV shows. I mean, it's amazing, but
I started as a print journalist, and all the rest of it just kind of morphed from that. Really, basically, just a storyteller using different technologies. Kind of kept up with the technologies as they changed over the course of my career.
Which is very cool. And of course, some of the technologies that you chose put you in a little more peril than others. You did some things that no print journalist ever did, or most filmmakers ever did. And I think that's probably a great place to jump in, and that's some of your really extraordinary explorations and expeditions. I understand that one of your first assignments for Nat Geo magazine, was it?
To Antarctica?
Yeah.
Yeah. That was my very first assignment for the National Geographic Magazine. I was a little young at that time to be considered a writer for the magazine. They used to like to employ mostly older gentlemen. And sadly, it was mostly gentlemen at that time. And I had to go down I lived in New York, and I had to go down to DC and be interviewed by a half dozen different editors, whether I was qualified to write this story. But yeah, I followed along a dogsled expedition that went 3,741 miles across Antarctica.
Just a weekend's travel, no big deal.
Over the course of 7 months. And, I would just drop in. I didn't go for obviously the whole route. It
wasn't your usual vacation, I would say.
No. It was 6 men from 6 different countries, and it was, obviously a great adventure. It was the last time that dogs were allowed in Antarctica.
How do you prepare for something like that?
Well, this team and I went with them, did training trips in the Northwest Territories. They did a big 1,000-mile long dog sled in Greenland. Prepping both the men and the dogs, because there were 12 dogs per sled. As you can imagine, this was a multi-year, $12 million expedition, funded by Gore-Tex and UAE, the big French insurance agency, and many others.
Wow.
But the lesson I learned from it was this was at a time that the Antarctic Treaty was being renegotiated, and in 1989-90, because Antarctica is the only place on the planet that is successfully governed by international treaty. And it was in 1990, it was to be renegotiated. So the intent of this expedition was to draw attention to Antarctica at a time that it was at threat, because there were many parties who wanted to open up Antarctica for drilling, for oil and gas. And the thought was that's not a very smart thing to do. So one way to stop that, one way to influence the decision in the spring of 1990 was to show what a beautiful place it was, and how remote it was, and how great it was that it was managed by this international treaty, etc. But it gave me incredible inspiration for the rest of my career, in that it showed how using adventure was a great way to kind of tell an environmental story. if I wanted to tell a story about the future of Antarctica, but I didn't do it, if I did it just from a studio somewhere, and I made a film about it, and you were punching through your buttons at night and just saw a documentary about Antarctica with no real action to it, you might click right by. But if you saw an adventure with 36 sled dogs and 6 men, and starting in the minus 40-degree temperatures and ending in minus 40-degree temperatures, you might hang out for a while and watch to see how it went.
See how many died before
Exactly.
it was over. How about the dogs? I mean, that's they literally had to fly the teams in kenneled cages through airplanes and airports and all that.
Well, every step of the way, David was incredibly torturous. It was a 6-person team, 6-man team, 6 men from different countries: France, UK, Russia, China, the United States, and whatever I forgot, England, or I guess that's the UK.
Yeah.
Japan, China, France, England, United States, and Russia. And one of the things that Russia's government offered was to fly the team down from Minneapolis. And so the Russian plane flew in, had to get special State Department. This is 1989. Cold War is just winding down. Had to get special dispensation to bring a Russian plane into the United States. They had to fly over Canada and then into Minneapolis. And they arrived on 3 out of 4 engines.
Oh, God.
So we had to load the sled dogs in, load the team in, load a bunch of Russians who'd won a trip like via lottery to come along on the plane ride, and then fly to and then get special dispensation again to fly across over the continental United States to Cuba, because Cuba was the closest place for parts for the plane.
Oh my goodness.
The Russian plane. So yeah, and so we spent a few days in Cuba and then onwards south to Antarctica.
Sounds like quite a fun adventure, setting aside the perils that are involved. It was quite an extraordinary confluence of events. I mean, Cuba of all places.
Well, the Outside magazine, when one of their anniversary issues, picked, I think, the openings to 3 adventure books as the best openings in adventure book storytelling, and one of them was our book Crossing Antarctica.
Nice.
Because it describes this landing in Antarctica. The cabin of this plane just filled with wet dogs and the smell of fuel and perspiration, etc., because we're landing in a place that and the plane nearly touched the wing and crashed, etc. But I asked the French member of the team what he was thinking at that moment, and he said it smells like adventure.
Yes. Well, adrenaline will do that to you.
Yeah. But with 36 sled dogs,
Oh, I get it. I mean,
they weren't in cages, they were kind of.
Oh, really?
No. I mean, they weren't just roaming around. They were tied down, but they weren't in boxes. Yeah.
With the was it a crosswind when you flew in? Is that why the wing nearly touched?
It was just, the plane was just so heavy, and a lot of the fuel was in the wings.
Oh.
And there was this. The plane then flew back to Russia and never flew again. I think they torched it or something.
How did you get out? Oh, it stayed there, waited for you, and then flew out?
Well, there was another airline company, another outfitter. Basically, he would fly. It was a company called Ken Borick, which you may have seen. They're based in Canada, and they have a fleet of Twin Otters, small propeller planes that they use around the world in adventure scenarios, and they had several of those positioned in Antarctica to do the shuttling.
You've traveled back and forth to Antarctica many times since. What kind of comparisons can you provide from this first trip there, when you saw it in a relatively unfettered, undegraded state, to perhaps the last time you've been there?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because in 1989, where we landed was an ice sheet, and
Melted
today,
by now. Yeah.
for the last couple decades, that ice sheet has been gone.
Yeah.
I've been to the Antarctica probably 25 times, on a couple times by sailing, a couple times by plane, many times by boat with Lindblad Expeditions as a lecturer.
Incredible stuff.
And one of my favorite stops are a couple of the small science bases where when they built the science bases, they built them right up against the glacier, and now several years later, those glaciers have retreated by quite a bit.
Yeah, it's such a frightening topic. We'll perhaps get back to that, but you also kayaked there, didn't you?
Yes.
That's saying something. So this
Well,
place is not just really cold. It has all kinds of unique danger. When you're on the land, there are fewer predators. Of course, there are some notable ones, but when you're in the water in a kayak, I'm curious, you kayaked something like 600 miles in Antarctica, didn't you?
yeah, the first time, yeah, we sailed down there twice, and the reason we sailed was because there is no place to stay in Antarctica. You
No
can't really
hotels.
even even the limited camping we did, I had to have special permissions from the State Department, the Environmental Protection Agency, on and on and on, because they don't want you to, because it's governed by international treaty. The leader of the expedition that becomes the lead country. So the United States we had to follow their rules for operating in Antarctica.
Yeah.
But there's no real, I mean, I guess there are seals and whales and things, but in terms of predators, it's not so bad. It's not like the North where there are polar bears who are kind of mean. But we had to sail down in order that we would have a place to sleep at night. So we would kayak during the day and sleep on the boat at night. And we did it one time, and then kind of repeated it a few years later, and we took 3D cameras. We made the first 3D movie in Antarctica, which showed at all the IMAX theaters in the museums around the world.
So no scary moments, no unusual
Well,
events that
plenty
stand
of
out.
scary moments. We at anchor at night, and the anchor drifts, and all of a sudden the boat's either stuck on land or afloat. That happened a couple times. We did run aground one time on a piece of moraine, piece of rock that we couldn't see. And you don't want to. There's no 911 to call. There's no Coast Guard. There's no rescue. So you've got to save yourself.
And the moraine being the retreating, the stone rubble at the retreating glacial site.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
we were, it's typical filmmaking. You try and get as close as you can to stuff, and we got too close.
Nothing bad though while you were kayaking in the water.
No, no, not really. Just the camp. We did camp a few nights, and it was super wet and miserable and cold, and
Yeah.
yeah, because when you're on and then Antarctica now hosts. I'm making this up, but kind of a ballpark number. Antarctica hosts 55,000, 60,000, 65,000 tourists a year.
Yeah, that's like Disneyland in a weekend.
Yeah, and most of them arrive by cruise boat. And but there's some people who think that that's too much tourism, but the tourism is limited to a tiny little slice of Antarctica. And if visiting that tiny little slice sends people home as ambassadors for protecting Antarctica, then I think it's okay.
Absolutely. What it's probably one of the least visited, even though you're talking about a number of tourists, that's still small by comparison to most places, and it's one of the least understood places on Earth. What should people know about Antarctica that made it not just so alluring to you, but so important to protect?
Well, all in this season of climate change and the hottest days on record, it's extremely important because as Antarctica changes, it impacts the rest of the world. Antarctica could fit inside the United States could fit inside Antarctica easily. So it's a continent, it's land. It's not like the Arctic, which is just frozen ocean. And as a result, there is, and also Antarctica is the driest place on Earth, which people don't often think of.
No.
Is when it does snow and when it does precipitate, it doesn't go away. It's rarely above freezing, rarely.
Right. Interesting.
So even though there's 3 miles of ice at the South Pole, for example, along its edges, it's very much at risk because the ocean is warming, the contact between glaciers and the warming sea are more frequent, and as a result, the ice along the edges of Antarctica is changing and changing fast, to the degree that some of the biggest ice sheets, monstrous ice sheets, have broken off and have floated north and melted, adding to what is inevitably going to be some serious issues with sea level rise.
Well, I mean, Florida, Key West, this last couple of days was what, 93 some degrees, the water temperature?
Yeah, I saw that. Awful.
Oh my goodness.
Awful.
And when you're talking about the melt from Greenland exceeding all of the human freshwater use in the entire planet every year, that's just Greenland. It doesn't bode well.
No.
We're going to have to do something.
These are things that have been, I'm not going to say long predicted, but have been predicted for decades.
Right.
But we kind of arrogantly thought, well, that'll happen in the future. Well, the future has arrived.
People haven't been listening to scientists on this subject forever. I mean,
No.
the word hoax has creeped into the current lexicon, but even before politicians were saying climate change was a hoax, people were pretty much ignoring it. Maybe out of fear, they didn't want to acknowledge it. They thought it would go away if they didn't think about it.
They thought technology would somehow save us. And I guess today people regard technology as turning up the air conditioning, which is not really a solution.
Every day you hear about some new technologies that really do raise the possibility of some hope. But the problem is we've left it so long, and the problem is so immense, it's going to take massive global participation to really turn it around, don't you think?
Massive participation to a degree that we can't even comprehend. The
Right.
first time the global warming was mentioned to the layman across the United States was in 1988. So what's that? 12, 23, 30 odd, 40 odd years. We've known of it. We knew it was coming, and we've made some progress. I'm not going to say we've made none in terms of switching to some alternative sources of energy and trying to distance ourselves from burning fossil fuels, et cetera, which is a number one contributor to all of this melt. But we're not doing it fast enough, and simultaneously we have monstrous populations growing in India and China and the rest of the world that all want a middle class life like we have.
Yes, it's daunting. So let's talk about some of the more fun stuff for a moment again.
Yeah, that's right. Get off. We don't want to bum people out.
Well, you know what? I'd almost rather bum people out a little bit to get them moving in the right direction, because there's still most of the population isn't accepting that we have a problem, and that is unfortunate. But
do you think that's true? But David, do you think that's true today? I mean, given these last couple of weeks where I live in rural New York or upstate New York, and we've had these horrific hazy days, which you guys I know are out in Southern California are more familiar than we are, from the wildfires of Canada. We've had the incredible heat and floods and rains and storms, and I mean, I think people, whether they get the connection or not, I think they're starting finally to realize that there is a connection.
I would say the people that are willing to listen have gotten the message there's a connection. What to do about it, maybe they haven't figured that out yet. But most of the people that have been saying climate change is a hoax are, I think, literally given that option by public figures who feel that they have no responsibility to tell the truth or to find the truth themselves. And so when people can hide behind those kind of comments and pretend like it's all just a hoax, it makes it harder and harder for the rest of us who are, I'm really worried about it. And I don't know, frankly, if we're going to catch up to where we could have been had we started. The only good thing about it is I do believe we have some technological understanding and advances now that we didn't have earlier. So if people had woken up in 1988, as you mentioned, they couldn't have done as much in terms of their own life. Now there are options. I mean, just electric cars are no solution, but they're certainly better. And there's a lot of growth in that area that if they can get rid of the mining and some of the rare earth metal issues, they're all incremental changes.
But they're especially good in a place like Southern California where you are, because you can create your own electricity through the sun.
Yeah.
Where I live, if I plug the Tesla in out to the wall outside, I call the energy company. I say, "Where does my electricity come from?" They say, "Oh, it comes from burning coal.
Yeah.
We don't have sufficient sun here." So
Well, there is that.
it's coming. It's coming. It's coming.
Yeah, there is that. And solar has made huge advances in the last 10 years. I mean, it was not sufficient in Southern California 10 years ago. And then it got better and better and better. And now nations are using massive solar fields to power a lot of things. And as you know, there's hydropower and hydrogen extracted from water power and many other technological advances that I'm hoping will catch on fire more like the forests than like your fireplace.
Right, right.
We need a big conflagration in terms of breaking through on these power sources to really, I think. I mean, one of the things we're working on at Ecoflix involves a system called crops, where we're trying to convince people around the world to stop burning the residue of their crops. Huge amount of carbon goes straight into the atmosphere, and there's a system that's been studied now for almost 20 years to bundle it up safely and drop it in the deep ocean, where it'll take hundreds of years to break down, and that's where it'd end up anyway if it went up through the hydrologic cycle. So it's a kind of a shortcut without the horrible climate related implementation. So there are plans, there are things, but we sure need to do better. But I want to keep going on your missions, because these are more uplifting. So I understand you spent 10 years again for Nat Geo sea kayaking around the world. And that was the Aleutian Islands, French Polynesia, Gabon, Tasmania, all the natural stops for anybody on vacation.
Yeah.
What was that like? And of course, you were honored as the Nat Geo Oceans Hero as a result of that. But I'd love to hear about some of these extraordinary locations and maybe nifty behind the scenes stories like you started to tell them.
Yeah. Well, I had one advantage. So I was introduced to National Geographic through this dog sled expedition, and it put me in pretty good stead. And that was in 89, 90. I continued to do some odds and ends of work with them. I did a big story about river rafting, on a previously undescended river in China for the Yellow magazine, for National Geographic Magazine. But then, National Geographic Magazine at that point had been a family operation forever. It was started by the Grosvenor family. Alexander Graham Bell was the second president of the National Geographic Society, and it stayed in the family for more than 100 years. And we all know what happens to businesses that are run by families for that long. I mean, at some point, it starts to splinter or disintegrate. And there'd been issues where you had National Geographic Television, you had National Geographic Magazine, you had other entities, and they were all great, but they weren't necessarily communicating that well together. So you could pitch something to National Geographic Magazine, but they wouldn't communicate to the television, or vice versa. So
you were a triple hitter. You could play in all those fields.
Well, not initially, but they came up with this plan where they were going to only fund expeditions in which the different department heads of National Geographic were all invested in. So they started this thing called the Expeditions Council. I was among the first applicants, and then that led to 7 grants in 10 years to as you described, to kayak around the world, one continent at a time. Now, and I had a couple advantages. One, I could write, because oftentimes people come to National Geographic with great expedition ideas, but don't necessarily have communication skills. So and in those cases, they would have to either hire a writer to after the fact recreate it, or maybe a writer to go along, or whatever.
Not so good, yeah.
So I could write, but also I knew how to. At that time, there was a lot of competition for funding from National Geographic for big climbing trips, but no one was really doing big sea kayak expeditions. I was kind of alone to a certain regard.
The words don't actually hang together very well. A sea kayaking expedition. I mean, to me, it sounds insane.
To me, it sounded fun. Yeah.
Well, it was probably incredibly fun, but my goodness, you're in this massive canoe on the I don't know, open ocean, or are you along the shorelines most of the
A
time?
boat, a little bit of everything.
That's just insane to me. I'm not a good swimmer, but
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. But the goal was not just to go and have a vacation or an adventure.
no, I
It was
know.
to go and use the kayaks to arrive at places that allowed us insight into an environmental story. Because that's what I've always.
And more of an indigenous type approach to it.
Well, yes, and when we would arrive in remote places, whether it was Vietnam or Croatia, we'd be accepted because we arrived by kayak rather than by motorboat or plane or
Absolutely.
we were accepted as you suggest, as more indigenous, as we were accepted as brothers and sisters.
Sure. Well,
So
you're in
yeah,
harmony
and
with nature, and that's a big distinction between the third world and the first world. And I think that a lot of these places probably really respected the fact that you made that effort and did something which is by all accounts extraordinary, but to them it's probably unheard of.
well, in different places they took quite notice, and some places they just kind of, oh, here's these dudes in boats, like because we were meeting most people who lived and worked and depended on their own boats, so we kind of fit in.
Nice.
Yeah, but we started in the Aleutian Islands. This took place over 10 years, from 1999 till 2008, 2009.
And how
And
long were these legs?
they ranged from 1 month to 2 months. We started in the Aleutian Islands with that remote, chain of islands between Russia and Alaska that hang down like a necklace. Super cold. It's if you ever watch that show, The Deadliest Catch.
Yeah, oh yeah.
That's where we were. Although The Deadliest Catch, the crab fishermen went out in February. We were in there at the height of summer, which is June, July.
I still can't imagine being there in a kayak.
Yeah, well, it was dicey.
That's a nice
That was four of us, and it was truly, truly great adventure. But when we brought that story back to National Geographic, it got a fair amount of attention because we were climbing these snow-capped volcanoes and then kayaking among the islands, and it was beautiful, and it was a big adventure. And it talked about even how in these remote islands there was pollution all over their beaches, mostly from things washed off of ships and things.
Yeah. Worse now, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, that's pretty cool. And how much time, I'm curious, would you spend in the open ocean, literally kayaking across?
Yeah.
Where you can't see shore.
Well, in the when you can't see shore, yeah. In the Aleutian Islands, our motto was paddle for your life. Because the water temperature was about 36 degrees. So if the kayak had flipped or you ended up in the water, you would have had. They said the Aleuts could live for 45 minutes in that water. We figured we had less than 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And that's overturning a two-person boat that weighs several hundred pounds, full of gear, shifting. I mean, it would have been. So thankfully we didn't flip.
It begs the question: could you have returned it to its proper side and gotten back in?
Yeah, big question. We didn't. When we practiced with the boats, we did them empty on a lake in California. So
a little different.
Yeah.
Wow. Any crazy stories you want to share about those trips?
Well, then we went after the Aleutian Islands, where we saw it was cold and it was windy and rainy. We saw no one in the entirety of the 6 weeks we were out there. And when we were on the water, we sprinted from island to island. So we didn't really have long days of paddling. So I wanted to do something that was 180 degrees differently. So we went next to Vietnam, where it was super hot. We had long days of paddling down the coast, and we saw, hundreds, thousands of people every day. So that was great. But that took me 2 years to organize, because there were permits and expenses and bribes and all sorts of stuff that had to be.
Well, and it helped, as you've noted in the other places, that you were traveling as the Nat Geo Explorer. I'm thinking about your Dazzler letters.
Yeah, that didn't hurt. Although, yeah, they would give you this embossed, laminated letter that said, "Dear kind sir," with a fancy stamp and ribbons and things. And it kind of read, "Dear sir, madam, please accept our esteemed colleague John," with whatever. And in some countries, people were all over it. They wanted to make copies of it. They wanted to keep it. In some countries, they didn't care at all. So.
Yeah, that's amazing stuff. And overall, your take from the kayaking in these countries as opposed to the sledding, in Antarctica, any kind of different take on it, or was it more of the same ultimately?
Well, not having to take care of 36 sled dogs made quite a huge.
But
I
I'm
mean,
not talking about the argers of the travel. I mean,
right.
sort of the lessons you learned. Were they semi-similar? It was gorgeous, beautiful, remote, and yet already suffering from climate change, or were there different messages?
Well, it was, most of the places we went, and I'll mess it up, but we went the Aleutian Islands, Polynesia, or Aleutian Islands, Vietnam, Polynesia, the Altiplano of South America, Gabon, Croatia, Tasmania, and Antarctica. And each of them had a different environmental story. And they weren't all bad. In Tasmania, for example, they'd done a really good job at managing their fisheries. So we had just been a trip or two before in Croatia where the Adriatic was completely overfished.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't catch anything in the Adriatic because it was so heavily overfished by international fisheries that when we went to Tasmania and discovered that actually the seas were rich and there was a lot of rules and regulations about what you could catch, what you couldn't catch, what you had to throw back, etc. And there were rules that were followed. That was a good story. So
Yeah.
it wasn't all negative.
Well, that's good. I mean, shifting, if we can, to your career in journalism, prolific just barely begins to describe it. Obviously, you started writing, as you mentioned, and that was great. But what drove you to write, first of all, articles and then book after book? Is it just something you love to do, or how did that evolve?
Well, I did like writing books. I haven't done it for about 10 years, but um, I was born in Normal, Illinois, in the
I'm from Detroit, so
dead center of the country.
yep.
And my family didn't travel. I didn't travel when I was a kid. I didn't have a passport till I was in my mid to late 20s. I didn't travel other than Mexico and Canada. I didn't travel outside the US. I mean, I was not born to adventure, but I was something, and I do a lot of talks in schools, and teachers always like this, is that I was a prolific reader.
Yes.
And I got turned on by books, and I read a lot about adventure, and that really, I think, was my inspiration.
You traveled through books.
Traveled through books, and so yeah, and I benefited from also, I think, at a young age, in my early teens, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a writer.
Yeah, but there's still more behind your massive body of work than just your awareness that you have a gift for creative writing and you're good at it and like it. You obviously had a message. There was something driving a lot of these books. What's the common theme?
Well, and from age 22 to 27, I ran a weekly newspaper, and I go back and revisit those pages every once in a while, and they're full of environmental stories. I
Right.
don't know, David. I wish I had a clue. I don't know quite what drove me to telling environmental stories or being curious about the environment, but I was, and that's been the connective tissue between everything I've done. But
You
when
know,
we had that 10-year long relationship with Geographic, doing what I called my Ocean's 8 project when we were kayaking, they since we were out there, they said, well, yes, you can write, but you're out there, make films. So I had dabbled a little bit in filmmaking. It wasn't brand new to me. So we started bringing back films, but some of the trips, like in Vietnam, which the project was called Descending the Dragon, I did a magazine story, I did a book, I did a TV show for National Geographic Explorer. We did lectures, we did part of their mission, the education stuff. But it's the same story. It's not like I'm going out and telling and saving one story for the television and one story for the book. If you went back and revisited them all, you'd see that it was one kind of cumulative story.
interestingly enough, though, it's different recipients.
For sure. For
Every
sure.
one of those mediums hits a different demographic, and that's kind of a fantastic thing because so many iterations of information, whether it be from a commercial to a award-winning movie, they have a very certain limited demographic. You can't get to everybody, whereas you were really hitting many tiers of the system. It's pretty great because
Yeah.
people
Well,
need.
I quit writing books because when the kayaking when the 10-year kayaking project kind of ended, I kind of stopped doing the kayaking because I was becoming the kayak guy.
Yeah.
And I didn't really want to be the kayak guy because it felt like it was a little too narrow. So since then, in 2010, we've only been making films. And when I say we, it's purposeful because films are made by teams, not by individuals, really.
Sure.
And I have so I haven't written a book since, but I threaten my team every once in a while when they're annoying me that I'm going to go back to writing books. You know, I don't need them anymore.
Yeah, I think just talking about your career up to this point, obviously you have not been narrow in your scope, so it's no danger to say that you could do any and all of those things, and it's pretty fantastic. But so let's get to another chapter, and you don't have to explain to me, at least, why you enjoy your own radio podcast show, because I agree with you. It's really a joy to connect with remarkable people. So let's talk a little bit about the things that you like to talk about on your show, and in particular, connect that to your over what 20 some short films about the Hudson River Valley.
Yeah.
How do you summarize, first of all, your passion and information gathering and distribution about the Hudson River challenges?
Yeah. Well, as you can imagine, I've traveled quite a lot.
Don't have to imagine.
Yeah.
We're just heard about it.
How many countries are there? Not counting territories, etc. There's 195, 96, 97, something like that. And I've been to 90 plus, but that means I've only been to half the world. It means I still have half the world to explore.
Yeah.
There are only a few places I like to return to. Antarctica is one, the Polynesia is the other. I'm happy to go anywhere else there I've never been. That would be number one. But again, going back to that notion of being a journalist, I'm a storyteller. So anytime I can get an audience and get somebody on to talk to, I'm happy.
Yeah.
We have a community radio station here in Kingston, New York, in the heart of the Hudson Valley. It's been on air for, now about 5.5 years. And I was on from day one with the Green Radio Hour. So every week for 5+ years, I've done an hour-long interview. Usually it's 2 interviews per. And I say this, and then I realize that probably certainly a lot of, if there are any younger viewers out there that have no idea what I'm talking about, but I say, well, I enjoy it because I have a pretty good Rolodex. But I'm pretty sure that a lot of people out there have no idea what a Rolodex is.
I know, it's shocking.
Yeah. So and this timed perfectly with the pandemic, so that it kind of forced me to stay in touch and find somebody new or somebody interesting to talk to every week. And that includes writers, filmmakers, environmentalists, etc. A lot of them are local here to the Hudson Valley, but a lot of them are scattered literally around the country and around the world.
Can you share some of the films and the messages you're trying to pass along? Because I want to make sure Ecoflix viewers get the benefit of the lessons that you are offering to people that come from not just your own experience, but the somewhat tragic experience there in Hudson River.
Yeah. Well, going back to that notion of traveling a lot, I have maintained a home here in the Hudson Valley for 35 years. But for many of those years, I was gone. I think one year I was here 77. I was home 77 days. The rest of the time I was on the road. And it got to a point where I knew small towns in Chile better than I knew my own small town. And it's not genius, but I recognize that, you don't have to travel halfway around the world to find good adventure. You don't have to travel halfway around the world to find good environmental stories. Yeah. So
wherever you go, there you are.
Yeah, yeah. And so my team and I, decided that we would turn our focus to telling stories about our own backyard, mostly environmental stories, initially mostly about river-related issues, but also we've morphed into doing lots of agriculture-related films. And they're short films that literally range from 5 minutes to 40 minutes, and they're under the banner of Hudson River Stories. And I started out doing a series called The Hudson River at Risk, because the Hudson River had this bad reputation for being polluted. It's apocryphal but true. They used to say you could tell what color they're painting the cars at the GM plant in Tarrytown based on the color of the river, which is bad.
And it's a very telling tale of, what all kinds of industrial pollution represents.
Yeah. Thankfully, in the last 40 years or so, 50 years or so, the Hudson River has actually been cleaned up incredibly. Uh, even as I say that, and I hate that I now have to follow that up with, it is one of the largest Superfund sites in the country due to the dumping in between the 1940s and 1970s of PCBs by our friends who make things. What's the G General Electric motto? We make good things for life, or
Yeah, right.
yeah. Yeah, they made things not so good here in the Hudson Valley by dumping oil basically into the Hudson for 30 odd years.
But that's kind of a human conceit. People everywhere seem to think that, gee, I'll just throw this one wrapper, I'll just dump this one bottle of whatever, I'll get rid of my refuse, and they dump it into the ocean because they figure the oceans or the rivers are so big. How could this one little thing matter? And there's just no appreciation for the massive collective impact of that kind of disregard for nature. It's
Yeah, well, we saw it here. And they knew, even though there were no laws prohibiting what they were doing, they knew they were doing the wrong thing because they would do a lot of the dumping at night.
sure, exactly.
Yeah. But
Well,
since
but
then,
governments in broad daylight have streets and highways draining right into rivers and oceans all over
right,
the country.
that's right.
And that's happening in the daytime, and they surely have to know they're doing the wrong thing.
Yeah. So that the first series we did was the Hudson River at Risk, and we looked at PCBs in the river. We looked at the fact there was a leaky nuclear power plant at Indian Point on the river. We looked at barge traffic and travel by train and barge and et cetera of oil and gas right along the river, and those, they were very good, well produced, interesting, powerful stories. But I took them around New York State and showed them, and I got bummed out.
Yeah.
Thought, well, I'm living in this beautiful place, and I'm just taking these kind of horror stories around. So we switched, we pivoted, and we started a series called Hope on the Hudson to look at more positive, optimistic stories. And that, I think, there's now a dozen stories. A lot of them are going to be on Ecoflix soon, which is great.
Yeah. Well, that's our brand. We, from the beginning, I was of the view that whether people will pay attention to a negative story is that, it's up for grabs, but nobody wants to be depressed about whatever it is. And so if they're not getting something enriching from watching, it's hard to keep their attention. And so our entire ethos is uplifting stories that are not Pollyannish. You can talk about the problems, but talk about hope. Just like you said, Hope on the Hudson is perfect.
But the benefit for me was I got to know my own community better.
Mm-hmm.
I got to know the really interesting people in the community better, and so there's been a payoff all around. And yeah, and as you noted, we've now made more than 20, probably close to 30 different short films about different issues here, and we have a good following. When we first researched where we might show the films, we came up with 300 groups who work on environmental issues up and down the Hudson River.
It's amazing. Well, tell your followers that soon there'll be a swim lane dedicated to Hope on the Hudson, and
Nice.
they can see all of those. And talk a little bit about how sea level rise is relevant even to local rivers like you're dealing with.
Yeah. Well, sea level rise is relevant to everyone and anyone who lives on a shoreline or coastline around the world. It's coming up equally around the world. Yeah, it's anticipated that the sea level of the Hudson River will rise at minimum 2 to 4 feet by 2100, maybe more. And with these big rains and floods of the last few weeks, I could take you, if we were driving instead of talking on the phone, I could drive you over to a couple places where the rivers and streams and creeks are still out of the water. Part of that's storm related, but part of it's made worse by the fact that the sea level is coming up. They've got a big plan in and around New York City. The Army Corps of Engineers is considering to build a $52 billion series of gates and barriers. And we collectively, who look at these issues, paid a lot of attention to their plan. And the one thing they fail to mention in any of their plannings is the impact of sea level rise. They're preparing for a storm surge.
Mm.
They're not planning for the fact that storm surge will be combined with higher sea levels. So it's going to be a continuous problem, and all of us are wrestling with how to solve that.
Yeah. One of the things I'm trying to look at is ways to take local water sources. Hudson River is an example, but oceans all over the world. It's a challenge to desalinate, particularly with the electrolysis or energy dependent, mechanisms. And if we can crack that code, figure out a way to purify and desalinate all these water sources, we could literally green the deserts of the world. We could change everything, and all the water we could use wouldn't take a dent out of the oceans rising because there's so much water coming.
Yeah, well, I wish I had the solutions, but here on the Hudson River, it looks kind of grim. There are multiple bridges across the Hudson. I drive across one or another of them daily, and I start out my drive by going, "Wow, this is unbelievably beautiful," because it is. The Hudson Valley is an extremely beautiful part of the country. But by the time I get to the other side of the bridge, I'm bummed out because there's no commercial fishing anymore. Fishing, in part due to the PCB issue that we mentioned before, there's no commercial fishing. So there's no boats, there's no fishing boats on this beautiful body of water, even though there are fish. But the fish are, contaminated by many of them by the PCBs on the floor of the river. So you can't take them.
I'll give you the bright spot there. It will force industry to find better ways, different ways, and it'll allow the fish to repopulate, and hopefully over time there'll be a change in the entire approach. I heard an amazing lesson from Robin Hendry Tennyson. He's another remarkable expedition explorer guy like you. He was living with the Yanomamos and indigenous tribes in South America long before. He's very much older than we are, and he's been doing it forever. And he remembered a story where he was in it with a tribe, and they went out and had this incredible catch in the river with nets and brought in tons of fish, and they were cooking it and eating it and salting it and doing all these different things. And a week or two later, he says to the chief, he said, "So when are we going to go out fishing again?" He said, "Next spring." And when he asked him why, he said, "Well, how do you think we had so many fish to catch?"
Yeah, that's right.
So living with that mindset, maybe you're forced right now to stay out of the river for those kinds of purposes, and people will learn other ways, and then maybe the river can come back and it won't have that much pressure on it.
Maybe. I hope so. I hope you're right. But because the Hudson River is a Superfund site, the EPA has to come every 5 years and re-inspect to kind of confirm it. And they're doing it right now as we speak. But 5 years ago they did it, and they had public hearings or public meetings afterwards. And when pressed, it took them a while to admit it, but the EPA admitted that it would be 100 years before it would be safe to eat fish from the Hudson River. And this is after it had already been fishing had been nullified for 50 years. So that means for 150 years, man, has spoiled this river for fish.
Are they using any water purification mechanisms, or what are they doing?
Well, the problem is with the PCBs, they all settle on the floor. So there was a big fight. I mean, the big environmental groups, of which we have several really good ones here, chased GE, General Electric, for years, and GE spent hundreds of millions of dollars fighting any kind of cleanup. They did finally come in, and they did do some cleanup, but they didn't do enough. But that was their concern. That was the argument, is that they would come in, and if they started mucking around on the bottom of the river floor, it would just reintroduce the stuff to the flow of the river. And so that kind of worked and didn't work all at the same time.
Challenging, very challenging. Wow. Well, I'm sure good minds are on it. I hope they.
Yeah. And I do want to say, that I think we're extremely lucky here in the Hudson Valley. I don't know about how you feel out in your corner of the southwest there, but we have, I say it all the time, even though I have absolutely no empirical data to back it up, that we have more environmental activists per capita in the Hudson Valley than anywhere in the country.
Well, that's a good thing. Although I have to say, traveling to the UK, I found it's one of the hotbeds of people paying attention to nature. I mean, you go around the United States and ask 1,000 people what COP is,
Right.
and you can't find 10. I mean, it's just frightening. But hopefully we're going to get there. And despite the lack of involvement of people who aren't themselves as directly involved as some others, maybe we'll turn a corner. But back to navigable waterways, any lessons learned for other civilizations around the world that are maybe not even aware of their problem yet, but are doing things that they should know better?
Well, speaking of environmental groups, I mean, one of the groups we work with most closely is the Hudson River Keeper. And it was the very first of these keeper organizations around the world. There are now more than 350. And I'm a huge fan of citizen science and citizen involvement with local environmental issues. People ask me how I maintain any kind of optimism, in that oftentimes it seems like we're only telling negative stories. But for me, the people I meet who have become environmental activists not through intent, they didn't, at 15 didn't say, I want to be an environmental activist.
Right.
They probably said, I want to be a doctor or a lawyer or a house mother or whatever. And then it's announced that, a pipeline is going to be built across the street from them or in their backyard, or there's some kind of native pollution that's in their neighborhood. And all of a sudden they become the go-to person for that issue. And their work and family life takes kind of a back seat, and they just dive in. And that's what gives me optimism, is these people who, what I call accidental environmentalists.
Right. Are there any industrial efforts along the Hudson to do, there's a river, Thames, that goes through Essex County in England, and they are looking at doing a variety of things to draw the water out, purify it, and use the water as a power source for industrial activity adjacent or near to the river. And then the water is sent back pure. It comes out polluted, it's cleansed, energy is derived from it, and then it's put back in the river. Anything like that going on in Hudson River?
Not really, but the Hudson is unusual in another way, in that it is tidal 100 miles. So that where I live, 100 miles from New York City, 100 miles from the Verrazano Bridge, where the ocean meets the estuary, up to where I live, 100 miles away, it changes day in, day out. And the tide comes in and out, 4 times a day, and which is unusual. Most rivers flow way downstream. And the analogy, or the example I use all the time is that we were filming once in New Orleans, and overnight a barge coming downriver on the Mississippi River T-boned another barge crossing the river and dumped 400,000 gallons of oil into the Mississippi River, which is the drinking water for New Orleans. And within 24 hours, even though there was oil along the shoreline, there was no oil in the river, because the Mississippi is big and powerful and moving in one way. The Hudson's like a bathtub. It goes up and down, swishes around. So if there were to be such an oil spill on the Hudson, you'd have that stuff forever, because it would just be back and forth, back and forth. So no, so we don't have that kind of, so far, we don't have that kind of cleansing operation as you describe.
Yeah. So drawing on the accumulated knowledge, we've touched on the surface of so many things. What overarching lessons or insights can you share that, in general, the population, certainly of America, but the rest of the world, needs to learn? I mean, Ecoflix is worldwide, and there are countries that haven't caused as much harm as countries like America have to their natural spaces. What would you warn them? What would you warn us? Things that we should do before it's too late?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. We're making a film, a lot of my work right now is based here in the Hudson, but we're making a film simultaneously in the Maldives, looking at coral gardening. how to resuscitate coral in the country that has 200 islands surrounded by coral reefs, and the coral reefs are obviously it's incredibly important for the health of the
Right.
ocean.
Yeah.
And the former president of the Maldives, you may remember, is a guy named Mohammed Nasheed. The guy, one of your neighbors in Southern California, John Schenck, made a really beautiful film about Nasheed called The Island President. And, you know, he this was 10, 15 years ago. And Nasheed was running around the world, you know, per invitation, saying, hey, our islands are disappearing. It's not our fault.
Right.
We didn't do this, you know,
Right.
It's you guys. But we're happy to participate. You know, we're all in this together. So let's work on these solutions together. But, you know,
Right.
we didn't cause this.
Well, the acidification, of course, is not going to help the coral situation any.
No. Well, the Maldives, like much of the Indian Ocean in 2013, the Maldives heated up by 2 to 3 degrees Celsius in one season. They killed everything. So anyway, so they're experimenting. I mean, they're trying to do the right thing. They, you know, they've got man involved, trying to, you know, regrow their reefs there, and you know, it's kind of working, and we hope it works better. But you know, there's no guarantees.
If you could give people one message to do better to help the planet, what would you want them to focus on?
Yeah, just pay attention. You know, I mean, do all the we've all heard the advice of, you know, using less electricity and using less gasoline and et cetera, all of that stuff, which is all valid. But like you, David, I'm a big consumer of news, and I think that helps me form my days, and the way I live is based on what I learn from paying attention to the media. So I participate in the media. I'm a big believer the media makes a difference. So what I advise people all the time is, you know, make reading, watching news clips, watching TV shows about environmental issues part of your daily consumption, just so that you're smart about these issues and not ignorant, and not as if you're not paying attention.
Good advice. I appreciate it. Jon, what a pleasure it's been to talk to you. I'm so thankful that you're out there doing the great work, and thank you so much for making the time.
Yeah, thank you, David, and thanks for the opportunity to share our films on Ecoflix.
It's totally our pleasure.